In our last video, we created 3 new heroes for the Imperium. This is for my custom chapter that maintains deep ties to Holy Terra, of which their chapter master chooses to reflect that relationship in their iconography and bestowing sacred helms with crests from the myths and stories of Terra's past. These relics are given to the heroes and leaders of the chapter. However, to make sure those sort of details really have weight, we need to focus on the paint scheme. Here is our original reference model. For what I knew about painting at the time, I thought this turned out really great. However, with what I've learned, I want to give this scheme a proper update. To start off, we're going to use the boar as our subject. Because a lot of detail will be going into this model, I decided to split this series into 2 videos. The second one is going to be focused on painting the headdress and the crest itself, which I really loved how it turned out. But for now, we're going to focus on the armor. I used an olive brown as a base, something nice and dark for the recesses. After that, I worked on all the joints and soft armor areas before I moved on to any greater detail. It'd be a real pain to clean off pure black pigment on any of the later steps. Once the joints were done, I cleaned up the general areas around them. So for our first layer, I'm using a medium leather brown. This is going over every surface of the model, while maintaining the deep recesses with the olive brown. This leather brown is really going to play into the shadow work, so it won't be seen too much, except for the real covered areas. But also for the highest points on the model, it's going to act as a lighter shade for the recesses rather than the darker olive brown. That way there's still a distinction between plates when there's supposed to be direct light on the area. This will definitely play through the most regarding the shoulder pads. This is also a learning process for me, reapplying this paint scheme, but using the new skills that I've learned over time. Mainly using paint thinners instead of water, which helped a lot get rid of that chalky look, as well as learning blending techniques and applying shading to a model. And that should be about it for this layer. Now that the entire model has been covered with the leather brown, this is where we split the process for our quartered pattern. We're also starting to decide where we want the light to be hitting the model, which means we're still going to paint over most of the panel spaces. So this layer is going to help us bridge the gap between the shadows and the lighted areas. Because this is a thinner pigment, I also went back over the areas to make sure that the pigment is solid and the true color of the khaki really stands out, rather than bleeds through. Though adding that second coat almost looks like it's creating shading, if you stop there, it's going to make the blending process a lot harder. So I made sure that the areas painted were solid by the time I was done with this step. When defining where to put the split for the quartered pattern, especially on this model who has such a twisted torso, I really just assumed where the middle line of each plate would be, and I didn't get too exact until later steps where the final line really matters. Some areas were easy to trace, however, like the backpack, given that there are 2 bolts to trace between right down the middle. just adding that second coat like we talked about before. At a certain point in painting, the knife that was stuck in the boar actually fell off. I decided it was for the best. The knife made the model a little too tall to make sense, so I just ran with it. But I really love how much character these helmets give these Marines. Okay, that is one half done. Let's move on to the next step. We're going through the same process with this lighter leather brown. There's a small amount of orange pigment in this leather brown, which I think really helped make the shadows pop more for these sections of the quartered pattern. And again, this is going to fill up most of the space, but making sure both of the recess olive brown and the darker leather brown are still visible to produce the difference between the colors that we want for our shading. This is another pigment that doesn't go on so well in one coat, so we have to make sure we give it another one once it's dried. Just taking the time to go over all of the larger areas again. And our second layer is done for all of our sectioning. Now we get to start applying the uniform tone that we want. For this, we're using a much brighter khaki, which is going to define the major lighted areas. So this is very forward-facing and upward plates that the light will absolutely touch. So for today, I am assuming whatever is lighting it from above and the most outward parts of each panel. Though I'm sure some areas might be more shaded than what I'm painting currently, I'm really just having fun with it to see how to apply the technique rather than being overly precise at this point. There is also this attempt to make sure it is clean but grimy, to really keep that filter of grim dark, yet you can tell this is still a militant force that maintains their armor. They still look like proud warrior monks of the Imperium. So that's just our first coat. We're going to add a second coat of the khaki to make sure it is strong in its pigment. That way the shading is easier later. And as I said, we really want to make sure that the khaki stands out as the true tone of this scheme. And that should be about set for our second layer. Moving on to the other sections, we're coming in with a lighter brown. Again, aiming for the more prominent light touching areas of the model. Because of this darker tone, this is also going to lay the groundworks of the highlights for these sections of the quarter pattern. Because this section is a darker color, all the techniques are applied slightly different, dependent upon the lighting and which of the two tones I really want to see more of. And we're just going to go through again to make sure everything is nice and stable. Awesome. All set. Now we're going in with some blending to clean up some of this choppiness on the model. There were generally 3 different techniques I was using for this process. For one, I would mix the paints together until I had a middle pigment that blended them well enough. Or I would use the 2 colors and water them down enough with a medium thinner and go over the blending space with very little paint and glaze over until a smooth transition was established. This was also a step where I could push back shadows or lighted areas until I felt like they were more perfectly spaced. Each area was different and had different lighting requirements, so I took my time and considered how each space would be affected, or simply where I wanted the effect to be stronger. This far in the process, I considered it pretty good and moved on to adding much deeper shading between moving plates and joints. This is the only time I decided to use a wash. I used a strong tone wash, which is really just a dark brown, rather than a black wash. Some time ago, I decided to stop using black as a color for shading, rather using very dark browns and building up a brown wash to create the darkness. Black I feel like should be reserved for very intentional spaces, like the joints on the armor, or an object that you want to stand out or even feel disconnected from the rest of the model. I feel that this also helps with creating the look of grimdark. It gives a grime to it that we talked about earlier. It also supports the colors and blends in with the mood. Finally, we get to move on to our highlights. Highlights have always been a doozy for me. They always came on too strong, or that they were almost disconnected. So what I decided to try was, first I had to paint the edges of each armor plate, as well as any space that I wanted to make more defined or stand out. Just going through and choosing the edges that I want to build up the highlight to. For the second part, I blended the khaki and the highlight color and pushed it up towards that edge. I found this to be a pretty solid mix, so much so, I applied the same technique to the other sections as well. First I hit all the edges, which came off pretty strong for the darker side. Then I mixed the paints and blended them towards the highlights, which I found pretty satisfying. Because this video is more so about the armor, I skipped ahead and painted the bolter. I had a couple ideas on how I wanted to paint the bolter, but I figured red was a nice style for leaders and lieutenants. There's only a few things left to do, so let's move on to the purity seal that we applied to him in our conversion video. As a base for the parchment, I used a beige, followed by a cream white. This allows the beige to act as the more shaded or darker spaces of the scroll work, which then I used a mix of glazing and blending to make those tones transition better. I used a pure white to hit the most prominent and active parts of the scroll. And finally, a strong tone wash between the scroll work and any objects or armor around it. Everything was looking great, but then I realized I overlooked something. I was so lost in painting, I forgot that both pauldrons are khaki. So we're going to take care of that real quick. Starting from our dark leather brown to our dark khaki in 2 coats to our regular khaki, 2 coats. Blending and pushing back the spaces. Getting that top highlight on. Blending it back. And that's better. Everything's looking strong. I like the shading. The highlights are pretty solid for the first attempt at this technique. I think the definition between the plates and the darker recesses turned out great. I like the shading for what it is. I love the feeling of grimdark renaissance I get from it. There's only one thing left to do. I tried painting the Aquilla a gray, but either because of the colors or the application, it looked a little too strong. So I decided to restart with a different idea. A nice burnished gold to match the headdress. I did, however, keep the gray work on the Purity Seal stamp. That felt fitting enough. As for the chest piece, we started with a black gray and built up to our burnished gold. This whole process has to start very, very low and dark, especially on such a small and intricate area. And this piece has already been painted over a couple times from my previous attempts. 1 for the model already being painted, and 2 for the attempt earlier with the gray that we saw. So the detail is a little hard to get out now. Once we get that first layer, we're coming back with a different mixture that has more gold particles in it. Fanning out to the general area of each feather or edge. And the effect we're creating is that it plays in the light, so the dark spaces remain dark while the highlights are able to dance. We're doing one final pass over with a much more intentional gold, but still has dark pigments in it because we don't need bright and shiny. We need harsh and dry. To fix some of the mistakes, I went back with the black gray, going in between each highlighted feather and making that dark space again. Here I used a wash to really separate each level and plate. I've done this before on golden areas for Aquillas to create that depth. However, for the burnished gold, it actually diminished the value, so moving forward I won't be doing this. The wash had a bit of a glossy effect, and those recesses need to stay dark. But otherwise, for now, I really love how it turned out. There's a few things added that we didn't record, like the leather pouching and the display monitor on the wrist. And as I mentioned before, we left the headdress and the crest in another video because it took so much time and detail that I felt that it deserved its own episode. Here he is next to the original concept for the paint scheme, so you can see the contrast and the difference in the work. The original had a lot of harsh highlights and very dark recesses, mainly due to overusing washes at that time. And though I still love it and it's a great memory, I love seeing the new techniques I got to learn and apply to the paint scheme. Well, that's all we have for this video today. Keep your eyes open for the next video when we paint the head crest. I'll also be releasing a video on how to paint the red bolter. I love how it turned out, and I'd like to share that with you. Besides that, you guys let me know who you'd like to see painted next, the eagle or the Pegasus. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. And to keep up with our hero's progress, consider subscribing. Thank you for watching. Phantom out.